Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos a nuestro foro durante el día de hoy. Bueno, esta es una actividad programada y organizada por la Unidad contra la Trata de Personas en alianza con la Casita, el Centro Cultural Hispano. Vamos a hablar hoy sobre la conciencia a la acción, tratando de enmarcados en la Semana de la Concientización sobre la Trata de Personas 2021. Este diálogo que hoy empezamos es un diálogo bilingüe donde realmente le damos la bienvenida a todos los inmigrantes de habla hispana para que de una u otra forma pues puedan conocer lo que significa esta grave violación de los derechos humanos y cómo podemos salvaguardar a nuestra comunidad. Les recuerdo pues que el tráfico de personas es un delito y una grave violación de los derechos humanos. Cada año miles de hombres, mujeres y niños caen en las manos de personas inescrupulosas quienes los trafican en sus propios países y en el extranjero. Para esto pues y para ampliar este tema, hoy les recordamos también que el tema de este año pues sitúa a las víctimas de la trata de personas en el centro de la campaña. Para eso el CTU le dio la oportunidad a plantear el tema María, uno de los cortometrajes que está presentando, pues para darle voz a esas personas que lamentablemente han sido víctimas y que este año pues representan el tema central de esta conmemoración. Para eso pues vamos a darles la bienvenida a los oradores del día de hoy, a Kimoy Thomas, directora adjunta de CTU, Sharifa Amon, asistente de investigaciones jurídicas de CTU. Entonces, muchísimas gracias a todos por estar con nosotros y pues bienvenidos al equipo de la Unidad contra la Trata de Personas. Muchísimas gracias.
At the end of this presentation, we would all know how to better safeguard ourselves as well as to safeguard our neighbors and what steps to take if we encounter potential human trafficking situations. Next slide. Okay, so this is what the presentation is going to entail. We are going to look at the roles and functions of the counter-trafficking unit because we represent the counter-trafficking unit. Then we are going to look at what is human trafficking, who is a victim of human trafficking, and then some information is going to be provided on how we determine who are victims of human trafficking. So we are going to look at the screening mechanism that is used by the CTU. There are certain indicators as well that tell us whether or not a person is a victim of human trafficking. So those will be discussed as well. Information is going to be provided on how to report suspected cases of human trafficking and which authorities should be contacted to make such reports. And then, as we all know, human trafficking is a transnational crime. It involves several players. So it's very important that our unit, the CTU, work hand in hand with other agencies. So we're going to look at the collaborative efforts of the CTU, as well as the care and protection that is meted out to victims. Adriana, am I going too quickly for the translation?
Well, I'm trying to find out with Eli. Is he doing fine? Eli, ¿tú vas bien allí con la traducción? Oh, ok. Oh. Demasiado rápido. Ok, déjame hablar entonces. Muchísimas gracias. Ok. Yeah. Kimoy. Okay, Ellie want you to take a little more time because in between lines has a lot of information you need to share with us today. And
okay.
Yes, when you speak too fast, you know, he kind of missing out some details. I also want to take the opportunity to remind everyone we have two channels. Those who speak English can keep themselves in the English channel, and those who speak Spanish will have to switch to the Spanish channel. O sea, aquellos que hablan español, por favor, este es el momento para que se unan al canal de español y pues podamos, para que puedan entender todo lo que está exponiendo nuestro ponente el día de hoy, nuestra oradora. Entonces, por favor, aquellos que todavía no han cambiado del canal de inglés al canal de español, pues pueden hacerlo para que puedan entender toda la ponencia. Thank you so much, Kimoy. Go ahead.
Okay, can Eli give me a thumbs up, or perhaps he can say okay so that I will know to continue to speak?
Just give me a second. This no, what are you doing? I think I went in the wrong then. Hold on. Eli, ella va a intentar comenzar, pero que por favor, así sea en el chat, le escriba si va muy rápido, ¿ok? No, entonces por favor le escribes y yo le hago saber, ¿ok? Puedes hacerlo, sí, yo le escribo para poder, o en el mío o en el de ella privado, ¿ok? Ok, perfecto. Sí, gracias. Kimoy, he will write you in the chat if anything.
Okay, great.
Private chat. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I will just start over with the presentation outline. So the first thing we are going to look at is the roles and functions of the counter-trafficking unit. Then we are going to discuss what is human trafficking and who is a victim of human trafficking. After, we're going to provide some information on how we determine who are victims. So we are going to look at the screening of victims. Then there are a number of indicators that help us to determine if someone is a victim. Those will be discussed as well. Many of you would also want to know how to report suspected cases. So we are going to provide information with that as well, which authorities you can contact. And as I said before, human trafficking is a criminal offense that has several players. So the CTU has to work in close collaboration with a number of entities. So that is going to be discussed as well. Okay, I saw your message. Thanks. All right, sure, for next slide. Okay, so as all criminal offenses, human trafficking has a law that governs it in Trinidad and Tobago, and it is called the Trafficking in Persons Act, Chapter 1210. As such, if you were to go onto Google and type this in, all of the provisions of the Act would appear. So you'd be able to see all the offenses and what the Act treats with. This Act came into being as a result of the United Nations Protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. And as we know, all countries that have signed on to this protocol were required to implement laws to treat with human trafficking. So in Trinidad and Tobago, there's the Trafficking in Persons Act. What this act deals with is human trafficking. It also creates and empowers the counter-trafficking unit. I'm just waiting for Eli. Right. So the Act, it empowers the counter-trafficking unit. That is the unit that we are representing today. Next slide. And these are some of the objectives of the Act. As you know, human trafficking targets vulnerable individuals, and these are the victims. So the Act strives to protect and assist these persons. Another way in which these persons are assisted is by having their cases properly investigated and the perpetrators prosecuted. So the Act provides for this as well. It's also important to know that Trinidad and Tobago as a state needs to cooperate with other states as well as international organizations and local NGOs to fight human trafficking. So if you read through the Act, you'd see that this cooperation is also provided for. Next slide. Right. So who are we? Who are we at the counter-trafficking unit? We are a specialized, multi-dimensional unit in the Ministry of National Security. Specialized because we treat solely with human trafficking matters. And we are also multi-dimensional because if you look at the composition of the CTU, you would see a number of different professional personalities. So for example, we have a director, a deputy director, attorneys, and specially trained police officers. Because at the end of the day, these police officers, they are not just dealing with the perpetrators, but they also engage frequently with victims. So these police officers have to be trained to deal with victims in a particular way, in a trauma-informed, victim-centered manner. We also have social workers, because later on in the presentation, you'd see that victims have several needs. And as with any other agency, we have administrative staff because reports have to be filed and other administrative tasks have to be done. At this point, I want to stress the fact that all employees of the CTU are positively vetted, meaning we have to undergo a number of tests to ensure that we are not connected to criminal elements. So on this basis, it is very safe to come to the CTU if you need assistance, if you think someone is a victim of human trafficking, or even if you need information. Some of our core values, we are victim-centered, because at the end of the day, most of our work deals with protecting victims, caring for victims, and seeing that they get justice. We are also ethical and confidential, because victims, they have a legal right to privacy. So we can't go and post pictures of them on the internet or in the newspaper, or give their names or their relatives' names to the media. We also need to cooperate with several entities, not just ministries, but also local NGOs, even faith-based organizations. We are also very dedicated and respectful of our victims. Next slide. And this slide looks at some of the roles and responsibilities of our unit. So as I said before, we are responsible for the day-to-day operations of the counter-trafficking response of the government. So whatever the government is doing pertaining to human trafficking, we assist with coordinating it. We have to work with all the agencies. Our police officers play a pivotal role. They have to do investigation, they have to gather evidence. So many times they would go into homes to gather evidence. They would take up items to prove that a human trafficking offense did in fact take place. We also have a hotline to take reports, but that will be discussed later on. We screen persons to determine if they are victims, and once that is determined, we treat with them in a particular manner. And we also liaise with government agencies, civil society, and international organizations. The work never stops at the CTU. Next slide. So I'm now going to hand you over to my colleague, Sharifa, who will delve deeper into what exactly is human trafficking.
Okay, thank you very much, Kamoy. So this is a legal definition of trafficking in persons taken from the Trafficking in Persons Act, or the TiPs Act, as we call it in Trinidad and Tobago. And we will examine this a little bit more in detail, but I'll just give you a breakdown of what the law says. So trafficking involves the recruitment, the transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threats, use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, or deception. It also involves the abuse of power or abuse of a position of vulnerability. And a lot of the victims, as you'd see, are vulnerable persons, and this vulnerability is usually exploited. It also involves the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve control over persons, and it is always for purpose of exploitation. And exploitation could take many different forms. So generally speaking, according to the Act, which is the law, exploitation includes keeping persons in states of slavery or similar to slavery. It includes compelling or causing persons to provide forced labor or services, as well as keeping persons in a state of servitude. It includes child pornography. It includes the prostitution of another, the exploitation of that prostitution. Okay, I'm just going a little bit slower for Eli to do the translation on the other channel. And it also includes things like forcing persons to transport illegal items such as guns, drugs, and ammunition. So let's break down what is human trafficking a little bit, in common language so that we could better understand, because the legal definition could be a bit heavy and cumbersome. All right, so we look at the three elements. So these are the sort of like the ingredients that we need to really determine if a human trafficking offense has taken place. An easy way for us to remember this is by looking at the act, the means, and the purpose. The act represents what is done. The means represents how it is done. And then the purpose is why it is done. So in the act, typically, this is what is done to the victim. Persons are recruited. And when we think of recruitment, think about like a job. So you might see an advertisement for a job in the newspaper. And now, of course, with social media, this is the most common way that persons are recruited. So someone can place an ad or directly message a person stating that they have this wonderful opportunity for them. And in the case of, generally in Trinidad now, what we are finding is that most of the victims who are from Venezuela are contacted by a friend of a friend or someone that they know on social media. And they are offered the opportunity, for better life in Trinidad, a job as a cleaner, a waitress, these sorts of opportunities. And then when they arrive in Trinidad, the situations might change, right? So other forms of the act also includes transportation, transfer, and harboring, right? Transportation could be the person being transported within Trinidad and Tobago, so from Shogunas to San Fernando or from Arima to Port of Spain, but it could also be transnational transportation. So persons could be transported from outside of Trinidad and Tobago, so from Venezuela, for example, to Trinidad and Tobago by boat, by plane, and then exploited when they arrive, right? In the means, this is how it is done, right? And the traffickers and the trafficking networks will use a variety of means. So they could use the threats, use of force, but a lot of the time what is used is psychological coercion and manipulation. Really getting into the mind of the victim and using their vulnerabilities against them. Sometimes persons are abducted, but there's a lot of fraud and deception. So false promises are used to really lure and entice people into particular work. There's also the abuse of power. So persons who may have a particular rank and status in society, they can use their influence in order to pay off persons or to threaten persons to keep them, in a state of fear and compliance. There's also giving payments or benefits to maintain control over other persons. And why is all of this being done? It's always for purpose of exploitation. And the exploitation, again, could take many different forms. So there's the prostitution of others. And in Trinidad and Tobago, prostitution is illegal. However, persons may willingly engage in prostitution or sex work because they feel that they have no other alternatives. And these persons could still end up being victims of human trafficking because they are being exploited by these traffickers who, may beat them or may take away all of their wages and keep them in, really poor living conditions, starve them, not allow them the opportunity to leave freely and come and go as they please. So they're still being controlled, even if they initially agreed to engage in prostitution or sex work. These persons could still be victims of trafficking. Then there's sexual exploitation. So this usually occurs where persons who did not agree to be engaged in sex work are forced to engage in such, or persons who are, raped or forced to participate in pornography and the like. Okay, so for those of us on the English channel, I'm going a little bit slower because Eli has to translate. Okay, so I'm still here. There's also removal of organs, but we have not had any reports of this in Trinidad and Tobago. Doesn't mean that it's not happening, but if we have no reports, we can't say that it is happening here, okay? And the other types of exploitation that I would have stated before would be things like forcing persons to transport illegal goods and items such as drugs, guns, and ammunition. So for cases of human trafficking, we have to remember that there has to be some sort of act. So that could be recruitment, transportation, transfer, And there always needs to be a means. How did the trafficker go about doing this? Did this person threaten the victim? Did they coerce the victim? Did they abduct a victim? And why did they do this? They did it either for the exploitation of prostitution, for sexual exploitation, forced labor, domestic servitude, slavery, or similar practices, or forcing persons to transport the guns, drugs, and ammunition. And just want to remind everyone that in the case of children, the means is irrelevant. So a person under the age of 18 who has been recruited and sexually exploited is considered to be a victim of trafficking. It doesn't matter how the trafficker would have gone about, getting them to do the particular acts. So it doesn't matter if the child was threatened or forced. By the very nature of that child being under the age of 18, they are considered to be a victim of trafficking. And this is because, children, persons under the age of 18 in Trinidad and Tobago, they need to be protected, and we know that their capacity to form judgment is a bit lower than a person over the age of 18. So a person who is under 18 cannot consent to being sexually exploited. They cannot consent to engage in prostitution. Okay, I'm just giving Eli enough time to translate again. Okay, I'd also like to point out that for a person to be charged with a trafficking offense, they just need to commit one act. So they don't need to do everything under the acts. They could just recruit a victim using threats, fraud, and deception, and for the purpose of prostitution or sexual exploitation or forced labor. Similarly, a person could be charged if they are transporting victims for the purpose of exploitation using coercion, deception, and fraud. So let's talk about the differences between migrant smuggling and human trafficking. A lot of times persons are a bit confused when it comes to these two different topics, right? So they have some similarities, but they're also very different. So smuggling is a voluntary service that a person, a migrant, would pay for or agree to in order to get across to another country. So it always involves transportation and it requires the crossing of a border. Whereas with trafficking, you don't need to cross a border for a person to be considered as a victim of human trafficking. And trafficking is a crime against a person, whereas smuggling is a crime against the state, because the person who was smuggled into the country would have broken immigration laws, right? However, when the person who is smuggled or enters illegally into a country, when they arrive at those borders, they are free to go. The difference with trafficking is that the person who may have started off as a smuggled individual does not have the choice or the freedom to leave. So he or she is not just brought into the country and then is allowed to start a new life without being controlled by someone else. So this is involuntary. Unfortunately, a smuggled migrant could become a victim of trafficking. And this can happen even before they leave their country. So for example, persons who leave Venezuela and enter Trinidad illegally may agree willingly to be transported illegally into Trinidad by boat. And they may not even be aware of the fact that the person who is arranging the transport for them intends to, exploit them. Then there are also cases where persons who were smuggled into Trinidad and they begin living their life freely, and they see an advertisement online on social media, Facebook and Instagram and those kinds of things, and then they become a victim of trafficking while being in Trinidad and Tobago. And not because they were smuggled into the country. It's separate and apart. And of course, if you all have any questions about this and need further clarification afterwards in the question and answer segment, I'll be free to discuss it a little bit more and to take specific questions on the topic, because it's a bit confusing for some people. Okay, so now let's look at some of the common types of human trafficking, right? So for example, in domestic servitude, what happens is that the workers in the private homes, they could be forced or tricked into serving, either cleaning the house, providing care for elderly or children in the household. And they are forced to do this because they feel that they cannot leave. And usually what happens is that the employer in that household will take their identity documents. So they may have been given the false premise that they'll come to work in this house, they'll be paid a particular wage, and it's just a regular job. But in reality, the employer, who they may have to live with, is very controlling and domineering, and essentially strips them of their freedom. And they may not even receive any payment for their work. Then in the case of sex trafficking, which is the most prevalent type of trafficking in Trinidad and Tobago, women, men, and children are forced into commercial sex. So that means that they are forced to sell sex, to engage in prostitution, which again is illegal in Trinidad and Tobago. They usually receive little or no payment, and they are held against their will or told that they cannot leave this type of work, and that if they attempt to seek help, that they will be reported to the police or to immigration. Another type of human trafficking in Trinidad and Tobago is forced labor. And this occurs where persons are, forced to work under the threat of violence, blackmail, or general other threats. Usually, again, their identity documents are withheld. And they are forced to work long hours, treated poorly, and receive little or no payments at all for their work. Bonded labor is another type, and it usually occurs in all aspects of human trafficking. So persons are, compelled to work to repay this debt. So they're held under the condition of a debt where they have to do a variety of work. So it could be domestic work, it could be sex trafficking, it could be regular labor on a construction site, anything you could think of, any job. But the condition is that they have a debt that they have to repay. And we'll talk a little bit more about debt bondage later on and what that really means. And then child labor, which is another form of human trafficking, is considered to be work that would deprive a child of their childhood. And again, we have to reiterate that a child is any person under the age of 18 years old, right? So this work prevents them from getting an education and may be very harmful to their physical and mental development. The minimum age of employment in Trinidad and Tobago is 16. So persons who are under the age of 16 are not supposed to be employed. And even when a child is over the age of 16 and they're legally employed, there are particular types of work that they're not supposed to be doing because it may be dangerous to their, physical and mental development. So children over 16 and under 18 should not be engaged in work that requires the use of heavy machinery or heavy lifting, as that could be very dangerous for them. Another key aspect that I want to let everybody on the chat know, well, on the call know, is that the minimum wage in Trinidad and Tobago is $17.25 an hour. So that means that persons are not supposed to be paid less than $17.25 per hour. And the person's legal immigration status does not matter. If you are employed, you are supposed to earn at least $17.25 per hour. So debt bondage. This is very prevalent in all forms of human trafficking. And this occurs where the victims are told that they would owe, these high sums of money for things like the transport, the accommodation, their food, and their clothing. They would usually be told that they cannot, leave the job or stop working in this agreement until they have repaid a debt. So for example, some victims would have told us that, they were promised a job in Trinidad when they came here. The persons who would have recruited them would tell them things like, you owe 3,000 US for the trip from Trinidad to Venezuela. Sorry, from Venezuela to Trinidad. You owe money for rent, you owe money for the food that you're eating, you owe money for the clothing, you owe money for everything under the sun. And of course, this person, would not have been aware of this prior to coming, or even if they were aware, the sum might not have been known to them, the sum of money. And they may be making, serious attempts to repay this debt but the debt is always increasing. So even if they work 7 days a week, 10 hours a day, at the end of the month, they still owe money. And every time they turn around, the sum is increasing. And this is used to keep the victims, in a state of fear and control, so that the trafficker is able to, manipulate them and control them. We have also encountered victims who have been able to repay these exorbitant debts, in order to regain their freedom and regain control of their lives, And it's very shocking when you hear of all of the things that they would have to, do in order to repay the debt. So in cases where women were prostituted, they may have to, take about 5 clients per day in order to repay this debt. So it's very important for everyone, to think if you know of someone, or if you yourself would have been in a situation where you had to repay a debt that you did not agree to initially, and that was always increasing and was ridiculously high compared to, the services. So if the person said you need to pay 3,000 US for transport from Venezuela to Trinidad, that is not a reasonable debt. These are some red flags that should be considered and may need to be reported. Okay, can Eli let me know if I could move on to the next slide? Okay, yes. So who are the victims? Of course, we know that anyone can be a victim, regardless of their nationality, their gender, age, or their socioeconomic status. However, there are some persons, who may be more vulnerable to being targeted by traffickers for exploitation. And the traffickers know this. They know that there are some persons who may be in more vulnerable positions, and those persons may be, easier to take advantage of because of those vulnerabilities. Oh, I just want to correct. One of the labor inspectors just reminded me that the minimum wage is $17.50. So it's not $17.25, okay? So these are some of the groups that are at a very high risk for trafficking. Persons who would have experienced domestic violence or physical and sexual abuse. Even persons who have substance abuse issues, so if they're addicted to drugs or alcohol or misuse these things. Persons who, are experiencing poverty or have, a lot of economic needs. Persons who may be in an irregular migration situation. Persons who have a very unstable living situation. So that means that they may be, residing in a household with lots of other persons, or they may be in that predicament where they are, what we say in Trinidad, begging a lodging. I don't know how you're going to translate that, Eli, but I'll try and explain. So it means that you're living with someone off of their good graces, and at any moment's notice, this person could tell you, okay, well, I don't want you living here anymore. It's time for you to leave. And of course, with COVID and all of the lockdowns in Trinidad and Tobago and, the different industries that have been, closed, all the businesses and the restaurants and stuff like that, a lot of persons are not able to afford to pay their rent. So they may have a very, unstable living situation. And young persons who would have experienced running away from home or come from families with a lot of instability, they may be at a high risk for trafficking. And why are these persons more vulnerable? So for the instances of domestic violence and physical and sexual abuse, these persons are particularly vulnerable to trafficking because they may be more accepting of violence, of control. They may have experienced such traumatic, they may have had such traumatic experiences that they are just more susceptible to being targeted and abused. They may not have, a network of persons to rely on. And they may also be more desperate in needing, shelter, needing a job opportunity, needing to provide for themselves and their family. So these are some of the factors that we consider to be push and pull factors that drive human trafficking. So in the push factors, these are things that would, as the word says, push or encourage persons to leave a particular country or city or town. And then the pull factors will be things that will, entice or draw persons to another country or town or city. So for push factors, where there's a lot of poverty, unemployment, low wages, political instability, even things like natural disasters, general violence, high occurrences of gender-based inequality, and food shortages. Those are factors that would really, make life difficult for someone or for people and encourage them to leave. And then the pull factors, of course, are the things that would encourage settlement somewhere else. So things like education, employment, higher wages, established communities, present. So that means where there's already an existing population from that country. So in Trinidad, there are already Venezuelan nationals living here. So persons from Venezuela would feel a little bit more comfortable coming to Trinidad and Tobago because they know that there are persons from their country already living in Trinidad. And we all, like community, we all need to belong somewhere. And we all look for persons who are similar to us. Going back to the victims again, we stated earlier that the victims can be identified by the presence of a number of indicators. The victims have rights, which must be protected. And we are very big on a victim-centered approach at the counter-trafficking unit, so we always strive to protect the rights of the victims. victims also require a lot of patience and understanding from the authorities. You know, they would have gone through a lot of traumatic experiences and it could really, really impact them. Sometimes the mere fact that the persons who were involved in their trafficking could be persons with, you know, power and influence in society, or could be police officers. It means that the victims don't generally trust very willingly. You know, their trust would have been broken from the start because somebody would have lied to them and exploited them. So they are less likely to trust even when they are receiving help. So we know that it requires a lot of patience and understanding. And we want to stress that persons who would have experienced trafficking or persons who are aware of incidences of trafficking, they should feel, you know, comfortable and rest assured that the counter-trafficking unit is aware of the issues that they would have faced, and we put the victims' needs first. So initially, a lot of persons, the victims, are not comfortable in sharing their experience because they may be feeling ashamed, they may blame themselves. And we want to let them know that this is a very safe space, is a very safe unit where they are specially trained police officers, specially trained individuals who will, you know, address their needs and their cases on a case-by-case basis, because not all the victims would be distrustful, you know, but we really try to tailor the treatment towards each victim.
Okay, so I'll take over here to walk us through the screening of victims by the Counter-Trafficking Unit. As I had mentioned before, the Trafficking in Persons Act empowers the CTU to coordinate and conduct the screening of persons so as to determine if they are victims of trafficking. In order to do this, we use a screening form, which gathers a lot of information, and it helps us to make that determination at the end. So I'm going to walk you through the form now. Next slide. Right. So the screening form is divided into several sections. So for example, the first section is very basic. That is where the interviewer gathers basic case and bio data. So for example, we would ask the person his or her name, nationality, his or her address, both in Trinidad and Venezuela. And I must stress here that all of the information gathered in the screening form actually assists the police with their investigations. We'd also ask the person if that person is married, if that person has children, and also get contact information for the relatives back in Venezuela or whichever other country they are from. And this, of course, is to ensure that those persons can contact their relatives so that the relatives would know that they are safe. The second section deals with recruitment. As Sharifa would have said earlier, the human trafficking offenses have several elements. So one of them is the recruitment. This is an act. So some of the questions, I'll give you some examples of the questions we'd ask in this section. Would be, for example, why did you come to Trinidad? Most times they say to work. Then we'd find out who invited them to Trinidad? What job were they promised? How were they contacted? Those are some of the questions, because what we realize, especially in COVID times, a lot of persons are being recruited via social media. And it's usually by persons that they know. So they would get a Facebook message, or they might get a message on Instagram. where persons are telling them to come to Trinidad to work at a bar, a spa. Well, now that things are closed, most of them are being told, you know, they can come to do babysitting. So all of this information we need to get from them in the screening form. The third section deals with transportation information. So of course, as Sharifa would have said, this is another means of a human trafficking offense. So we'd ask certain questions such as, how were you brought to Trinidad? Did you enter illegally or legally? Do you have possession of your passport or identity document? Because what we realize is that many times these persons are stripped of their identity documents because the traffickers use it as a way to control them as well as to limit their movements. And it's important to know that this itself, to take someone's passport, is an offense under the Trafficking in Persons Act. If someone is found to be guilty of taking another person's, a victim of human trafficking's passport, that person can be fined $350,000 TT and imprisoned for 12 years. Section 4 deals with harboring, which is another act for a human trafficking offense. And this deals with keeping the person in a house. So some of the questions asked here would be, where did you stay? Were there other persons there? And this is important information because sometimes one victim would be rescued, but there might be 5 others being held at a home. So with this information, the police can then decide if they want to go based on the evidence that they have to conduct another rescue operation and rescue more persons. The form also deals with transfer and receipt. So some of the questions asked here would include, did the person move from one place to the next to provide services? Who was responsible for moving them? Who received them in a second place, a second apartment? A trend today in recent times would be the traffickers using private taxis to transfer the girls from the place where they are being held to hotels, motels, or sometimes other apartments. So all of this information is important because it helps to establish the human trafficking offense. And as Sharifa would have said before, there must be exploitation. So some of the questions here would include, what services did you provide? We'd ask that person, what services did you provide? Were you forced to use drugs and alcohol to provide these services? What were your living conditions? What were your working conditions? All of these things would speak to the exploitation. And as we know, some of the exploitation could be sexual exploitation. It could be forced labor, which Sharifa would have gone through before. It could be child pornography if it's a minor. Or they could be used to transfer illegal objects, be it weapons or drugs. So all of this information is collected on the screening form. Next slide, please. Right. So after we gather all the information, the interviewer, that is the person who's questioning the person, the potential victim, can then make a decision if this person is a victim. So the information gathered would determine whether there was the act, which as we know could be recruitment, transportation, harboring, receipt or transfer. The information would also help to determine whether there was the means. So was the person deceived into coming into Trinidad? Was that person told, come to Trinidad to be a babysitter, but when they come to Trinidad, they are forced to be a prostitute? Was there psychological coercion? Was there debt bondage? So that is where, as Sharifa would have said, they come, and then they are told, you know, after you work, you could pay us back for the cost of the travel. But yet, no matter how many hours they work, no matter how many days they work, the debt seems to keep increasing. Another way that they are kept in this bondage is by being fined. So what you would find is that some girls, as they start to pay off their debt, additional charges are added on for perhaps not cleaning the kitchen, not making up their bed, things like that. They are fined for everything. They are fined. Sometimes if they refuse to drink alcohol or take drugs, the trafficker would fine them. And that is a way they keep them bonded to them in debt. The information gathered would also determine if there was exploitation. So for example, was there a case of child pornography? Was the person exploited sexually? Was the person a victim of forced labor? So the information provides the act, the means, and whether or not there's exploitation. Next slide. And of course, as with any other legal situation, there is the need for corroboration. So in addition to the information that is collected from the possible victim, what the police officers also look for is, for example, if a police report was made. What does a medical report say? So a medical report would say if the person was sexually abused, if the person was physically abused, if the person contracted an STI or is pregnant. All of these things can be used to support the information gathered by the screening form. Sometimes ticket stubs are provided. This would show the way in which the person entered the country, and it also treats with the element of transportation, because remember, transportation is an element of human trafficking. And if you look at the slide, you'd see an invitation letter, which is very important. This invitation letter doesn't have to be a hard copy. It could be a letter that was sent, an email or a message that was sent via Facebook, which is usually the way in which a person is invited to come to Trinidad, where their friend or sometimes a stranger would reach out to them and tell them about this job. They could come to work. They don't have to pay for their travel costs, things like that. All of these documents help to support the information on the screening form. Next slide. Right. So now, once there are the presence of the TiPs indicators, the person who is doing the interviewing has to ask the following questions. So let's say the person is deemed to be a victim of trafficking. We would first ask that person, do you want to return home? Because it is the right of any person, any victim, to return home if they don't want to stay in Trinidad. Let's say the person does not want to return home, the person wants to stay here. The person most likely as a victim would be eligible for assistance, which will be discussed later on in the presentation. Now, there are times when a victim might decline assistance, and it's very important that we determine why. So for example, someone might be a victim, but have relatives in Trinidad that are willing to take that person in. So the person wouldn't have need for accommodation, clothing, food. So it's very important that we determine if that person requires the CTU's assistance or if that person has assistance from family or close friends. And of course, based on the information gathered, it would be determined if there was in fact exploitation or the intent to exploit, which is just as important. Many times, persons come to Trinidad, they are prepared to provide services, but thankfully, the police might raid a particular place or do a rescue operation, and that person is saved just in the nick of time. Just before that person is forced to provide whatever services is required, the police would rescue that person. In such an instance, the exploitation would not have happened, but the intent is there because the person would have been recruited. The person may have been transported. The person could have been deceived, but the actual exploitation would not have occurred. Nevertheless, that person would still be a victim. The screening form also records other relevant information that would go towards the evidential burden, the evidential bundle that the prosecution would use. So for example, the demeanor of the victim would be recorded. Was the person bruised? Was the person crying? Did the person give one version of the story and then later change when he or she felt more comfortable with the interviewer? All of those things would be recorded. Next slide. Okay, sure, for your turn.
All right, this is just to give us a little bit more information on the nationality of victims of human trafficking in Trinidad and Tobago. So we see that the majority of the victims, 80%, are from Venezuela, and they would have been exploited for sexual purposes. Colombia would have been at 2%, Trinidad and Tobago at 2%, St. Vincent 1%, Dominican Republic 1%. So there are other types of victims, well, other nationalities, and Trinbagonian nationals could also be victims of trafficking. Then for the forced labor and domestic servitude cases, 4% of the victims would have been from Guyana, 1% Bolivia, 8% from India, and 1% from Nepal. And next we look at the indicators. I mean, we made a lot of mention of indicators, and indicators are generally the red flags that could alert persons to a potential trafficking situation that should be reported. So anyone in society, anybody in the community, any one of us could look at these indicators and we would know that something is potentially wrong that would need to be reported to the counter-trafficking unit in order for the police to initiate an investigation. It's also very important for us to remember as well that the presence of one or some or all of these indicators does not mean that a person is a victim of human trafficking. All right, so we just have to remember that there needs to be more investigation after we see the indicators to determine if there is a potential case of trafficking. So for example, some of the indicators could be where persons live in very large groups, if they live and work in the same location, if they allow others to speak for them when they are addressed directly. So if you encounter a person in public and you're talking to them and they allow somebody else in the group to speak on their behalf, this could be an indicator that this person is being controlled or is afraid, and something could be happening here, could be happening to them and would require some attention. If a person has fake or no identity documents, because we have found that a lot of the victims, they are not in possession of any of their identity documents. So they don't have a passport, they don't have their cedula, they don't have anything to prove who they are. And this is a method of control and a tactic used by the traffickers to really strip the victims of their identity, to keep them afraid of, law enforcement, to keep them, afraid of reaching out for help. Other indicators include being escorted wherever they go. So they are always accompanied by someone who is involved in their trafficking experience. They may be allowed to go out to Pennywise and to the grocery, but they are closely followed by someone. And again, this is an indicator that really speaks to the level of control that the traffickers will have over the victims, because they don't want them to be completely free to have the opportunity to leave and go. For the minors, they are usually unaccompanied and separated so that they are living without their parents, their relatives, or caregivers, and they're often in groups with other minors, or even in groups with adults who are not related to them. Oftentimes, what happens is that the victims, they will provide a scripted answer or inconsistent story. You know, if they go to a doctor's visit, or if they go to, you know, seek help anywhere or receive assistance, or even if you encounter this person, say, for example, in transport on a maxi, and you realize this person seems to be a bit uncomfortable or something is wrong, and you begin speaking with them, asking them certain questions, or if the police encounter the victims, but they are not aware that they are victims, they may just tell a story. They may say things like, I was brought with this person and this is my boyfriend. And they are just telling a story because they would have been told that in case you encounter the police, or in case hello? I see it was saying muted, so I'm not too sure if I am unmuted now.
Yeah, we can hear you, Sharifah.
Okay, yeah. So the victims may tell, you know, these scripted stories or inconsistent story. They may lie. They may try to cover up on behalf of the trafficker because they have been forced or told to say these particular things in advance. Some other indicators, you know, signs of physical abuse. So if they have injuries, cuts and bruises, if the person tells you that they have not been paid and they have a job, or they only receive a small portion of their salary, somebody is keeping the rest. If they are very fearful and afraid of the authorities, if they show, you know, signs that they are anxious, nervous, depressed, paranoid, these again are some indicators that something is happening to this individual. It could potentially be a trafficking situation. If they have very, very limited or no social interaction, so they're not allowed to go out, to make friends, to lime, to interact with anybody else besides the people that they live with. And also if they think that they are bonded by debt. So if they've been told that they have a debt to repay, those are some of the indicators. And these are some of the things that send trigger warnings, and persons actually call the counter-trafficking unit and make reports on behalf of persons, or, you know, they are aware of this happening to somebody else and they seek help from the unit. So this is where the police investigation would start if we receive this information. And we spoke about this a lot before, so I'll just go through this quickly. You know, how are the victims being recruited? So again, especially now in COVID, the majority of victims are being recruited online and by somebody that they knew, a friend of a friend. The things that are being promised to them are, you know, a better life, a job, the opportunity to make money in Trinidad and Tobago, which is very, very vague. But persons who are in desperate circumstances, they don't need a lot. They just need to hear that there's a possibility of work, possibility of a better life, possibility of providing for their family, you know, and their children, and they are excited about this. So the typical type of work would be waitressing, in a bar, in a restaurant, domestic work, cook, a dancer, an entertainer. And a lot of the victims did not know that they were going to be recruited for sex work. However, we are seeing a rise in cases of victims who were told that they would be engaged in sex work. But then when they arrive in Trinidad, you know, they are not free to choose their clients. They're not making any of the money. They have to hand over the money to the traffickers. And this is really how the traffickers control the victims. There's a lot of isolation, separating the victims from their family, from their friends. There's, of course, physical abuse, so beatings and torture, rape, sexual abuse. This is really to break the spirit of the victim, you know, to make them feel really, really horrible about themselves, to feel like, you know, something is wrong with them and that they deserve this sort of treatment. There's also starvation used as a tactic, you know, to keep the victims in such a malnourished state that they are easily manipulated. Traffickers also use drugs and alcohol to gain control over the victims so that they are easily exploited as well. Withholding their identity documents, we spoke about that a lot. That is one of the #1 tactics that is used by the traffickers. So they take away the passports or their cedulars and they're told that, you know, you can't leave because, you know, I have your documents. And that you would have entered the country illegally. So I could call immigration, I could call the police. So they're threatened with deportation. And there's a lot of psychological manipulation. So the manipulation could be very kind and sweet at the beginning. So they're, you know, charmed, they're given gifts, a lot of attention. However, it could turn very ugly and they could face a lot of intimidation tactics, dominance, and then there's the trauma bonding, where the trafficker would tell them that, you know, you deserve this, or where else are you going to go? Or it's better than what you came from. Think about your family. They're starving, they need food, your mother needs medicine. As well as the threat of violence against their family and friends, or the shame that they would feel if their family and friends knew what they're doing.
Okay, so now I'm going to just share some information on how a report on a suspected case of human trafficking can be made. The first line of contact should be the CTU's hotline, which I will provide later on in the presentation. And I want to stress the fact that this hotline is anonymous. So persons don't have to be afraid to call. They provide how much information they feel comfortable enough to provide about themselves. So you don't have to provide your name. You don't have to provide your address or anything like that. You just have to give the information on what you think is going on that could amount to human trafficking. So that is one way you can make such a report. You can also call the landline. That number, of course, will be provided at the end of the presentation. Other ways to make reports would be just going into the nearest police station or calling the TTPS emergency response numbers. If it is that you are too fearful or you don't feel comfortable enough making the report, you can reach out to a trusted friend or an NGO, for example, someone from La Casita or another NGO that works closely with the migrant community, and that person from the NGO can also make the report for you. As we would have stressed throughout this presentation, the persons at the CTU, that is both the police officers and the civilian staff, are trained, specially trained to treat with these human trafficking matters. And we also want to help victims as much as possible, and we want to offer protection and care. So we are urging you to share what you learned tonight in this presentation to your other friends and other relatives who may not have been able to sign in. All the information you got, especially the contact numbers, which will be shared towards the end of this presentation. Because we are all in this together and we cannot fight human trafficking, which, as we know, it's something that involves, it's a large network. It involves a lot of persons. And the only way we can make a dent into it is if we all work together. So if you see something, even if you're not sure, it is better to make a report and it's deemed not a matter of human trafficking, then you don't make a report, and it ends up being a matter of human trafficking, and that person suffers. Next slide. Right. So when we decide at the CTU that someone is a victim of human trafficking, this person has a lot of needs. Immediately, such a person needs food, because most times, I believe Sherifa would have mentioned it before, these persons are not given a lot of food to eat. Some of them, you know, they are starved, and that is more or less to make them submissive. So they need food and urgent medical care. Most of them, they present with STIs, they have dental issues, a few of them might be pregnant, so they all need medical care as well. Within the first week of contact with the victims, social assessments are done. So we have specially trained social workers who speak to them to determine what other needs they have. Many of them, as a matter of fact, all of them are in need of accommodation. They all need somewhere safe to stay. They need food, as I said before, they need clothing, because many times when they are brought to Trinidad or they come to Trinidad, they are told to walk with very little clothing. So some of them might have 2 t-shirts and a short pants or a dress. So they need clothes. All of them tend to need clothes. And because of the traumatic experiences they would have been exposed to, they need psychological counseling as well. Next slide. So all humans have legal rights. With regard to victims of human trafficking, they have special rights. Their first right is the right to privacy. So again, that is why we want to stress tonight at this presentation that whatever information we get is kept confidential. A victim's name and picture cannot be made public. Information about the victim's family cannot be made public. So we really and truly respect the privacy of all victims under our care at the CTU. A victim also has a right to housing, education, and training opportunities. Because at the end of the day, these are individuals that would have come to Trinidad in search of a better life. They want to make something out of themselves. They want to be able to help their families back in their home country. So some of the training opportunities they would get would be, for example, and this is of course based on their passion, what they're interested in. You would see some of them doing makeup courses, hairdressing courses, the nail tech courses. Some of them have not completed secondary school, and they asked to complete that for us to assist them to complete secondary school education. Many of them express an interest in learning English as a second language. So this is also made available to them. They have a right to psychological counseling. These are persons who would have been exposed to the worst situations that you can imagine. So counseling is something that is provided to them as often as required. They also have a right to legal assistance and information. So many of them are provided with legal documents which would enable them to stay in Trinidad. In instances where persons are charged, they are provided with a minister's permit. And this allows them to work, to stay in Trinidad and work for a year. And of course, this permit can be extended for the duration of their matter in the court. As I would have said before, these victims always require medical assistance. So that is provided for. Some of them who are pregnant, they are enlisted in an antenatal clinic. So they get treatment right up to the point where they deliver their babies. And of course, they communicate with their families and friends, because the reality is many of them leave children behind and they need to speak to them to see how they are going. So that is done as well. Victims are even assisted with jobs because they want to be independent. They don't want to be depending on agencies. They want to stand on their own. They are actually very strong persons. So we at the CTU, we assist them by helping them to prepare their resumes, helping them to do job search. However, because of the pandemic that we are all subjected to, helping them to find jobs have proven to be a bit difficult because, most of the places are closed. But that is definitely something that we do. We help them to find jobs. Next slide. Right. So as I said before, human trafficking has many players. And just like that, the fight against human trafficking needs many players. So these are some of the agencies that the CTU works very closely with. Children's Authority. Some of our victims are as young as 14 years. That is the reality. So we work very closely with the Children's Authority because this is the agency by law in Trinidad and Tobago responsible for all children in Trinidad and Tobago. So the Children's Authority would assist us with finding them accommodation and also helping us provide medical care for them. Of course, we work closely with the TiPs and the Defense Force because these are the persons that sometimes make first contact with the victims. They are the ones who encounter them first. The police officers also do investigations and gather evidence. So our relationship is very strong with the TiPs. Then there's the faith-based network and NGOs. They are like our saviors because they help us a lot with regard to grocery items, clothing, all the different types of assistance that victims need. And the harsh reality is because of the pandemic period that we are in, a lot of the government funding has been redirected to this COVID fight, the fight against COVID, to medical care. So our funds are very limited, and that is where all agencies come in. That is where we all have to work together. As you can see from this slide, there's the International Organization for Migration, and then there's UNHCR. Those are international agencies that we also rely on. They assist us with groceries and also the courses that I would have mentioned before for victims. Many times these international agencies arrange for these courses to be provided for the victims. So it's really a family. We all have to work together to ensure that the victims get the care and protection that they need. Okay, so I cannot stress enough how limited our resources are. So I'm throwing it out there to anybody who is on this chat right now. If you are willing to make any donations, these are some of the items that we would really appreciate. You can also send this information out to your friends and other relatives who might be able to assist, or maybe you might know a company that would be willing to assist. As I said before, victims are always in need of clothing. Most of our victims tend to be on the smaller side, ranging from sizes 0 to 8 or 9. We may have a few bigger persons, and then there are the pregnant victims who sometimes require maternity wear. So we are always willing to accept donations. We appreciate it greatly. Many of the victims They are also very academic. They like to read, but because they cannot speak English, we cannot provide them with the Spanish books. So I don't know if anyone from the migrant community has Spanish texts or storybooks that they are willing to donate. They can as well. Toiletries are something that we always need, especially for our female victims. So as the slide shows in the picture, some of the items would be, the usual toothpaste, toothbrush, deodorants, body sprays, feminine napkins, those things like that. And some of our entities that donate to us, they provide grocery vouchers as well as vouchers for toiletries. And two of the main places that they get these vouchers from would be Extra Foods and Pennywise. That also helps a lot, because what happens in instances with the grocery vouchers is that the victims themselves can go to the grocery. So it gives them a sense of independence, and it also helps them to use their own thinking, their own judgment on how to, budget so that their groceries would last them for a month or 2 weeks, depending on the amount of groceries they get. We can never have enough towels. So if anyone is willing to donate towels, we'd accept that as well. And unfortunately, because of COVID, there are so many things locked up. We cannot provide certain activities for the victims, because they've always expressed an interest in learning to dance, not just the salsa and the different Latin dances that they do, but, they've expressed interest in like hip hop and reggaeton. But unfortunately, we can't provide that right now because of the fact that everything is locked up. They also like to do yoga and go on outings, but these things are paused right now. So if any of you, I don't know if after how long we have for a discussion, could come up with ideas that you think our victims would enjoy doing, we are open to suggestions. Most of these activities right now would have to be virtual. So if you can think of anything to suggest towards the end of this presentation, it would be greatly appreciated. Right. So if you want to get into contact with us, these are the numbers that you need to write down, or you could take a picture of it with your phone. The hotline is 800-4CTU. That is 800-4288. And as we said before, it is anonymous. It is very safe. You provide whatever information you feel comfortable with providing, or you can get somebody to call for you. The landline is 627-1339 or 624-0986. And you can call this landline if you need any information on what the CTU does, if you want to make a donation, of some of the items that I would have spoken about before, or perhaps you might want the CTU to do a presentation to a particular group. I don't know, maybe there might be a group of teenagers that you want to sensitize about human trafficking. You can call the landline or send an email to the CTU's email address requesting such a presentation to be done. So the CTU's email is countertraffickingunit@gmail.com. So please store this information and also share it with your friends and family members. It's very important. And then the final slide. Next slide. Right. These are some other agencies that you can contact. So for example, if you know of a child that is anyone under the age of 18 that is being abused, or you think is a victim of human trafficking, and for whatever reason you can't get through to CTU, you can always call the Children's Authority hotline, which is 996, and they are 24 hours. Another number for Children's Authority is 800-2014. You can also call Childline, which is an NGO that treats with children as well. It's a 24-hour hotline, and it's also bilingual. So if you can't speak English, you can call and make your report in Spanish. And the number is 131. Childline can also be contacted by 800-4321. And of course, the TTPS emergency numbers, you can call at any time you feel as if you are in danger or you know of anyone in danger. That is 999 or 555. So that is for any type of criminal offense. It could be a robbery, it could be a rape, it could be physical abuse, it could be an assault. You can call those numbers. And finally, if someone needs counseling, for example, they might be suicidal or someone is just having a hard time, they can reach out to the Rape Crisis Counseling Hotline. It's bilingual. It's also 24 hours. You can call any time of day or night. And the number is 866-7428. So again, save these numbers and pass it on to your friends and relatives and whoever else you think can benefit from having these numbers. All of us need to have these numbers because you never know when you need assistance. Next slide. I think that was the last slide. Right. So that brings us to the end of our presentation.